Hello, welcome in. It's another YouTube exclusive, continuing our series of best position groups. I do think that we've done a lot of position groups, but I don't feel like we've done enough. I kind of like the discussion about position groups more so than individual players at positions. So we've done a few of the individual position players, quarterbacks, wide receivers, but now we're starting to focus in a little bit more on position groups. So today we're going to do the secondary. All right. So best defensive back groups in the sport. And one thing that's kind of interesting about this, there's not many teams that can go five deep. A lot of teams have three back or four back out of their five. And I've also found it funny too. Nickel, which used to be like, oh, that's a valuable position. Now it's like, if you don't have a nickel, you're dead. So things have changed a lot in college football, and I think our list will help reflect that. At number 10, we're going to go with the Wisconsin Badgers. I think they have one of the better safeties in the country in Hunter Wohler. I think they have a legitimate difference maker at corner in Ricardo Hallman. I also look, too, at just how this group kind of matured last year and how many guys played. It wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think this is a group that has its best football sitting right in front of it. Now, the amount of experience the guys got last year, I think this has a chance as a unit collectively to improve drastically. And before we move on to number 9, this reminds me, I have to kind of start this with a bit of a caveat. Defensive backs are really hard to judge. Just so you know, very hard to judge because you don't play defensive back by yourself. It's easy to look at Will Johnson. Look at how he locks down the top wide receiver. Yeah, that's cool. But if the top wide receiver had 8 seconds to get open, he's going to get open. You know what makes Will Johnson one of the best corners in the country? The defensive line that Michigan has. So understand that while we're ranking secondary groups, it's almost impossible to rank them without giving credit to some other position groups as well within the defense. Okay, I forgot to start with that. So we'll continue on by going to number 9. This group, I think, is aided in some ways by their front seven. I think their front seven is one of the best in the sport. So at number 9, I have the Clemson Tigers. RJ Mickens is back. Avion Terrell is back at corner, who I think's best football is in front of him. Khalil Barnes at the nickel spot can play some safety. I think he's a star and proved that last year with some of the opportunistic plays that he played in at times last year. I mean, goodness gracious. He had 3 forced fumbles, 3 interceptions. He also had a fumble recovery, which he returned 42 yards for a touchdown. I mean, this is a guy that just flat out makes plays. Then you look at some of the veterans. You got Jaden Lucas back, who's played quite a bit in his career. You also can look, too, at Shelton Lewis, who's a true freshman last year, alongside Avion Terrell. And I feel like this Clemson group, in time, it's not yet a top 5 unit because there's still a couple young players like Terrell, Barnes, and Lewis. But in time, we might be talking about this group as one of the best in the sport. And like I said, their defensive line and the pressure that group might apply is only going to make this group collectively a whole heck of a lot better. Let's go to number 8 and go into the Big 12, where we talk about the Arizona Wildcats. They bring back 4 of their 5 starters from a year ago, including Tacario Davis. Now, Tacario Davis is outrageously long, and he's 6'4". And when you think about kind of how they've structured their back end, his length has made it really difficult for the opposing offenses because he can just cover so much space. So if you roll coverage in his direction, which you can do, you don't have to do, whatever, you roll coverage in his direction, the windows get smaller because of that 6'4" frame. So really difficult to account for. You also have Traden Stukes back at corner. You also have Gunnar Maldonado, who's back at safety. These guys both played at a high level at times last year as well. So Arizona comes in at number 8. At number 7, a little bit lower than what most of the rankings have, and that's Iowa. Now, Iowa, granted, without Cooper DeJean, still excellent. Sebastian Castro is back as one of the best corners on the interior that you'll find in the entire sport. Was a first-team All-American according to some publications just a year ago. But if you look at what they bring back too, with Xavier Xavier Wonkpa, and all the other kind of safeties that are back, like Quinn Schultz and some of the other guys as well, Jamari Harris, Deshaun Lee. These guys are flat out good across the board. And when you think about Iowa, it's always noticeable to see how they can use their eyes to affect the opposing quarterback. That's a group that you just never really want to play because they're very mindful of every step that they take. And when their eyes are in the backfield, they're moving in a direction, but they might actually be covering a different part of the field. So this group collectively does a great job. Now, the issue that I have with Iowa when looking at what might be this year is that Iowa, in the division that they've played in the last couple of years, hasn't always faced game-changing talent at wide receiver. That's going to change this year with them getting rid of divisions in the Big Ten, with them welcoming in Oregon, Washington, USC. They're going to see a lot different style athlete. And that should be interesting, I think, when evaluating Iowa moving forward. So some people have them top 2, top 3, top 4. I have Iowa at 7 because I'm in a little bit of see it to believe it mode with some of the personnel they'll be facing moving forward. Here's another group that's a little bit lower than I think others might have them at. It's Georgia. Georgia, they return only 2 players off last year's team. The good news is Malachi Starks is one of the best safeties in the sport. That's a great starting point. And if you look at what they bring back in Dalen Everett at corner, they should be in a good spot there as well. The problem is Dalen Everett got picked on a little bit last year from time to time. But if you look at kind of where things were and how things projected, he's going to be just fine. I mean, he's a talented player, but had to kind of get his feet wet. I look at Georgia and I look at the loss of Lassiter at corner. I look at the loss of Javon Bullard at safety. A lot of people say, well, Georgia's at worst, number 2 in the country. I disagree. I think those 2 guys were 2 of the best at their respective position in the sport. So them being gone is not going to be just some plug and play. I look at Georgia from 2022 and 2023, looking from one year to the next. They lost some really good players in 21 and 22 along the defensive line. So guess what? In 2023, they weren't as good. Well, I look at the amount of turnover that Georgia's had in the back end, and while I'm optimistic that they'll be able to adequately replace with young personnel like Ellis Robinson, KJ Bolden, among others, I think they're going to be fine. I still think that there are some question marks there. That's why Georgia is not at the moment a shoe-in top 5 in the secondary. Let's go next to number 5, and this is the best team in the SEC, in my opinion. That's the Oklahoma Sooners. Billy Bowman is back at safety, 6 interceptions last year, 3rd among all defenders in college football. You look at Dasan McCullough, who's kind of a hybrid type of player, safety, slot, nickel, can do a lot of different things for you. I think he's really, really good. Doesn't cover a lot, but can apply some pressure. Good blitzer off the edges. He can do a lot for you. And then Peyton Bowen is a 5-star player that they're excited about as well. So I look at this group and look at how many pieces are back that played impact roles last year. And I think Oklahoma is really well positioned to transition nicely into the Southeastern Conference. We'll go next to Oregon. Oregon's in at number 4. And if you look at where Oregon was last year, yes, they lost some pieces to the NFL. They did, however, add some pieces via the transfer portal, like Jabbar Muhammad, which I thought was a great get from Washington. Led all corners last year with 19 forced incompletions. Many of the times he was kind of in a one-on-one situation. They also added Cam Alexander from UTSA, Kobe Savage from Kansas State, and Brandon Johnson from Duke. All were starters at their previous school. And when you look back at how Oregon rotated players a year ago, very few teams in the sport played as many players in the back end as Oregon. They would play oftentimes 6 or 7 safeties in a game, it felt like. It was absurd. They would just roll. So all the guys that might not have been, quote, starters last year still played an awful lot. And that's kind of been the case for Dan Lanning since he's taken over there in Eugene. He plays a lot of guys on defense. Oftentimes you'll see in the vicinity of 30, 31, 32 players on the field at some point defensively in the game. I'm not talking about mop-up duty either. Like, he'll roll them regardless of the situation. So when you have great players leave, like they had to leave last year, the next group up shouldn't have to fill that void the same way that other places have to fill it. Let's go next to number 3. This is the Michigan Wolverines. It's tough for me to put Michigan at number 3, knowing what they have there on the perimeter. I think Will Johnson is pound for pound the best corner in the country. You can make a strong argument on behalf of a couple others, and we will in just a moment. But I do think that Will Johnson holding down one side of the field is a massive coup for Sharon Moore in his first year as the head coach of the Michigan Wolverines. Now, they will miss Keon Sabb. And the more you watch Michigan last year, the more the season went on, the more you started to see Keon Sabb playing in a featured role. He decided to transfer to Alabama. That was, I thought, a huge loss. And then to make things even worse for Michigan, Rod Moore tore his ACL in March. So looking at all of that, it's not ideal, but they're still in pretty good hands with some of the pieces that are back in the back end. You still have Makari Page. You still have Quentin Johnson. Should be in a good spot. Those guys played a lot last year. And we're two, I think, the more consistent safeties, albeit I don't think they're complete game changers, still very consistent there in the back end. I think they'll be in a good spot there for the Michigan Wolverines. The top two are pretty easy for me. It's just a matter of which order. At number 2, I'm going with Ohio State. Now, if you look at Ohio State and what they have, I think you can make a case they have the best safety in Caleb Downs. I don't have any problem saying that whatsoever. Now, he's entering into his second year. Some people see maybe a little bit of a sophomore slump. I don't anticipate that. I think Caleb Downs is that good. I think he's an absolute machine there at the back end and immediately upgrades their group collectively from where they were a year ago. All right. You lost only one starter from last year, and that was safety Josh Proctor. I thought Proctor was a good player, by the way. Denzel Burke is back, and I think he's a top 10, top 5 corner in the country. You have Davison Igbinosun is back as well there at the other corner to go along with Jordan Hancock as well. So you look at all these guys that are back last year with the addition of Caleb Downs, and Ohio State is at worst the number 2 group in the country, pound for pound in the secondary. So I have them in at number 2, and then number 1, photo finish. Very, very close when trying to decide between number 2 and number 1. It's the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. They have, I think, one of the best corners in the country. Maybe the number 2, maybe the number 3, depending on what the pecking order looks like, in Benjamin Morrison. You have one of the best corners in the country. One of the best safeties in the country in Xavier Watts, who brought home the Bronco Nagurski last year. Best defensive player in college football. That's what some people would say. I don't know if I would put him at the top, frankly, as the best defensive player in college football, but from an opportunistic standpoint, 7 interceptions. It did not allow a touchdown in coverage last year. 2 pretty good spots to start. You also have the addition of Rod Hurd, which I think was massive, coming over from Northwestern. And I think he is a guy that people don't know right now, but should factor in there at the safety spot as another guy that could potentially impact the game. So if you look at what they have at both corner spots, one of the best tandems in the sport, one of the best safety tandems in the sport, assuming that Rod Hurd is as advertised, I think they're in a great spot. Couple that with the great front 7, Notre Dame brings home the title for the best defensive secondary in the sport. Hey guys, it's Greg McElroy. Thanks for watching Always College Football. Make sure you like, rate, and subscribe to ESPN's YouTube channel and wherever you listen to your podcasts.